So next speaker is Camilo Ronderos. Sorry, one second. Emma Mathisen, Noveck, and Ingrid Lossius. So can the next speakers? Okay, good. Can you share the slides? Okay.
Hi everyone. Okay, let me share my slides.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Here we go.
Yes. Okay,
Great. Can everyone hear me? Is this working? All right.
Yes.
Great. Yes. Well, thank you for having me here. It's a shame I can't be with you in person. It's like the middle of the night right now in Oslo. But all right, I'm going to be presenting to you some joint work with Emma Mathisen, Noveck, and Ingrid Falkum. This is ongoing work. I'm going to be showing 2 of the experiments that we plan out of a series of 4, and looking forward to what you guys think about it. So I just kind of want to start with this very broad statement that this talk revolves around, which is that the development of understanding non-literal language is typically described as having some sort of linear trajectory. So the way this is usually talked about, when children are faced with some sort of pragmatic phenomenon, they first derive a literal interpretation of this phenomenon. And only as they grow older and they reach a certain kind of maturational stage are they able to derive the correct or the appropriate non-literal interpretation of that statement. So this has been described famously to be the case for metaphors, where say that a child age 3 to, let's say, 8 or 9, here's a sentence like, the prison guard was a hard rock. They would first understand this to mean something like, either the prison guard was standing next to a hard rock, or a fairy came and turned the guard into an actual rock. But only when they're at around kind of 10 or 11, depending on the paper, are they able to derive the kind of like correct interpretation that this sentence is about the psychological state, perhaps, of the guard. Famously, this has also been, or similar claims have been made about implicatures, in particular scalar implicatures, where several studies have shown that when you give a child a sentence like some elephants are mammals, young children tend to think that this is correct. They tend to say, yes, this is a correct sentence, because they understand some to mean at least some. And at around the age of 7 or 8, they kind of start saying that the sentence is false. They start behaving kind of like adults, because they understand the sentence to mean, they understand some to mean some, but not all. Now, both of these phenomena, as well as several others, such as maybe hyperbole and irony, perhaps, are compatible with a view of language development that I like to call onion pragmatics. So this is a view that is most compatible with kind of the older literature on non-literal language, and also with John Searle's view. And you can kind of understand this as meaning that there's at the core of language development some sort of primacy of semantic meaning or of literal meaning. And only as kids grow older are they able to kind of derive kind of a secondary layer that goes around the semantic meaning to understand kind of like the enriched pragmatic meaning of several utterances. Now, even though this view can kind of account for the phenomena that I just showed you, in which kids kind of first go from the semantic meaning to the enriched pragmatic interpretation, there are other views out there that could also perhaps account for this data. Famously, this one by Ira Noveck from his 2018 book. In this passage from the book, Ira writes, "My contention is that the difference between young children, who are less likely to enrich meanings pragmatically, and older participants who do enrich meanings can be described as a distinction between an interpretation that is minimally satisfying and an interpretation that is richer and more refined." So in here, we wouldn't have a trajectory that goes from the semantic to the pragmatic, but more a trajectory that goes from the minimally satisfying or the weaker interpretation to a richer and more refined interpretation, or a stronger interpretation. Now, a problem that maybe you've noticed at this point is that it is usually the case in the phenomena that have been investigated that the semantic meaning coincides with the weaker meaning, and that the pragmatic meaning coincides with the stronger meaning. This is because we have mostly looked at so far cases of pragmatic strengthening. So the question here is that if we want to tease apart the semantic first and the weaker first hypotheses, we need to find cases where the weaker interpretation does not coincide with the literal meaning. This is where imprecision comes in quite handy, specifically in the adjectival domain, and for the case of maximum standard absolute adjectives. So maximum standard absolute adjectives are adjectives such as full, empty, straight, clean, round, and closed. They have been described in literature to be associated with closed scales and to be endpoint oriented, most famously by Canadian collaborators. Yes, I will share the slides at the end of my talk, if that's okay. Sorry, I just got this message in the chat. All right, so if I say that this line is straight, according to this literature, you would be kind of evoking the hypothetical straightness scale that would roughly go from completely bent to completely straight, and you would understand that this line is kind of at the endpoint of the scale because I've described it as straight. So this is kind of equivalent to saying that absolute adjectives are precise. So if I say that this line is straight, I'm saying that this line has to have the maximal degree of straightness in order to be or to be at the endpoint of the straightness scale. More generally, what Kennedy and McNally say is that these adjectives require the argument to possess the maximal degree of the relevant property. Now, an interesting property of these adjectives is that they can also be imprecise in their use. They quite regularly used imprecisely. So if I see a line like this is not a perfectly straight line, it's somewhat squiggly. But if I tell you that this line was drawn by a child or by someone with their eyes closed, you can kind of easily adjust the interpretation and say that this line is straight. So what some people have said about this is that when you interpret this adjective imprecisely, you're setting some sort of pragmatic threshold to determine how much pragmatic slack you're willing to tolerate in any given context. So how much deviation from the maximal standard will you allow in a given context? Now, the fact that these adjectives are precise in their semantics, but imprecise or can be imprecise in their pragmatics, makes them very interesting for our kind of ideas about the development trajectory, because it presents us with a case in which the imprecise pragmatic meaning is weaker than the precise semantic meaning, in the sense that it's asymmetrically entailed by it. If we think about it, this is actually the opposite pattern that we find in phenomena such as scalar implicatures, where the pragmatic meaning is typically stronger than the semantic meaning, and it entails it asymmetrically. So we have kind of a reversal of the entailment pattern. So to bring it back to the question of interest, will kids, when they're faced with an imprecise interpretation of these adjectives and a precise one, go from understanding them first to mean perfectly straight, and then only with as they grow older are they able to kind of derive the imprecise pragmatic interpretation? This will be compatible with the onion pragmatic view, or will they first kind of understand the weaker meaning and kind of be very tolerant of imprecision, where they can kind of just understand every kind of somewhat straight line to be straight enough, and only with age derive the kind of are able to understand the stronger semantic meaning. This would be kind of compatible with the weaker meaning first hypothesis. So in terms of testing this hypothesis, there's already some preliminary evidence. This comes from the seminal work by Kristen Surratt and collaborators from 2010, where they tested the interpretation of several types of relative adjectives and absolute adjectives in 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. So they found this interesting. They have this interesting finding in that they it seems that kids accept imprecise interpretations of the words full and straight, and they do so more often than an adult control group. So what they did in this experiment was that they showed kids 2 objects, and then they told the kids to show me the fuller one in the case of full. They did this also with big and with long and with other types of adjectives. But the 2 cases that are interesting for us are the cases in which there was a felicitous usage of an absolute adjective and an infelicitous one. So they either showed they showed kids 2 jars. One was full and and the other one about 2/3 full. And they asked, show me the full one. Or neither of the jars was full, but one was fuller than the other. And they asked the kids, show me the fuller one. And now what they found is that for the case of full being used infelicitously, whereas adults reject both of the jars and say, no, neither of these is full, and 88% of the times they reject this, younger kids seem to be doing the opposite. So they seem to accept or select the one that is fuller as the correct interpretation. So it seems like tentatively, this is kind of preliminary evidence in favor of kids being more tolerant of imprecision than adults. So accepting the kind of the weaker meaning first. However, there are some caveats with this paper. Most notably the fact that we only have a single imprecise trial per participant with a single absolute adjective per experiment. So they only saw one instance of full in experiment 1. Further, if the adults are rejecting the imprecise interpretation 88% of the time, it raises a question of how far away from the standard was this jar that the kids and the adults were seeing. So if we want to say that even adults tolerate some degree of imprecision, we would want to have a case in which adults are understanding it imprecisely as well to see how kids behave. They only tested 30 children, and this is related to the rejection rate with adults. It's not clear what the impact is from the distance of the input of the scale. So we don't have information about how full the jar actually was in their experiment 1. So this is what led us to kind of start our series of experiments in which we first aimed to do some conceptual replication of Surratt et al., but instead of showing actual objects, we did it with this tablet. We went around kindergartens and museums in Oslo to run our experiments on these tablet computers. And today I'm going to be presenting to you the findings from experiments 1 and 2, which were each run with 100 children ages 3 to 8 and a control group of 34 adults. We improved on the Surratt et al. Study by having 12 critical trials and not just a single one. And we controlled for the degree of imprecision, so the distance from the precise threshold. So the experiment was very simple. Basically, in each critical trial, kids first heard the sentence, show me the straight line, but in Norwegian, right? Along with 12 other critical items. So it was like, show me the the closed door, show me the full theater, something like this. And then they saw 3 pictures. The 3 pictures were either always a red X, signifying neither. So neither of these 2 is correct. And the other 2 either had a target image or a distractor. This was distributed in 3 conditions. So a kid saw one of these 3 displays in each one of the critical items. The target picture in the precise condition represents a precise interpretation of the relevant property. So the line is perfectly straight, right? Show me the straight line. The kid should always be picking this one. The distractor always had the correct referent, but the incorrect property. So it was like a completely bent line in this case. In the imprecise condition, we have a line slightly bent. So this is kind of our critical, most interesting condition. What are kids going to pick when they hear show me the straight line? And in the control condition, we have the correct property, but the incorrect reference. So it's a perfectly straight road. So in here, we would expect children to select the red X because neither of these is a straight line. Right. So again, this was a study that we ran with 100 kids, ages 3 to 8. It was a single factor with 3 level. This was Norwegian monolingual speakers. We had a small degree of imprecision across 12 critical items. We'll just dive right into the results. So first, we find that in the control condition, this is selection of, okay, so the first thing we did was remove selections of the distracted pictures, which were less than, I think, 3% of the data in this case. And then we had this coded with selections of red X as 0 and selections of the target picture as 1. And we find that in the control condition, kids are behaving as we would expect. They select the red X when there's no straight line available. They're able to say no, neither of these is a straight line. In the precise condition, the youngest kids behave as the adults. So when there's a straight line available, they select it quite easily. And the interesting thing that we find here is this developmental trajectory in the imprecise condition. So here in the middle, what we see here is that whereas the youngest kids select the slightly squiggly line around 93% of the times, adults select it at around 80% of the times. So we have a case that even when adults are actually quite tolerant of imprecision, the youngest kids are even more tolerant, which resulted in an interaction between these two conditions and this developmental trajectory here. Now, again, this is the condition where we see just a slightly squiggly line. This is where we find the kind of developmental trajectory in that adults are more likely to select the red X than kids. But now at this point, you might think, well, it could be the case that it's not about whether children are tolerating precision or not. It could be just a perceptual problem. So it could just be that kids are struggling at recognizing that this is a slightly squiggly line. Because these differences are actually quite small and they're all so close to ceiling, we would actually want to see whether they're able to recognize that the line is even squigglier, to see whether it's actually about how they tolerate imprecision and not about how they're kind of honing in on their kind of perceptual skills of or attentional skills of recognizing that this is actually not perfectly straight. So we also are interested in seeing how much pragmatic slack children are willing to give, how much imprecision they're willing to tolerate. So we ran this second study, which was identical to the first, but we had a higher degree of imprecision. So the line was even squigglier, or in our other items, for example, we had another one with a closed jacket. The jacket was slightly more open. So this is a more visible deviation from the standard. Other than that, it was identical to the first study. We had 100 kids, ages 3 to 8. Again, in each trial, they here show me the straight line, and they have to select one of these pictures by touching it. Same 3 conditions as in experiment 1, with the only difference being that the line is squigglier. There's a higher degree of imprecision. We also normed, I forgot to say this, before we were running these experiments, we normed how far away from the precise threshold these were across all our items to keep it constant. And here are our results. So again, we find that in the control condition, kids behave as they should be. In the precise condition, the youngest kids are behaving as the adults. And in our interesting condition here in the middle, we find 2 things. The first thing is that the development trajectory that we found in experiment 1 is still there. So the youngest kids are more tolerant of imprecision than the older kids and the adults. But we find an overall kind of an overall main effect of picture type relative to experiment 1, in that all of the age groups are less tolerant of imprecision. So this suggests that even though the youngest kids are more tolerant of imprecision, they are able to modulate their interpretation accordingly. So when the degree of imprecision is higher, there's less tolerance overall across all the age groups, which strengthens the interpretation that this is about imprecision and ruling out that it's about like perceptual or attentional factors, and suggesting that kids do have a sensitivity to understanding these adjectives precisely and imprecisely. So we have these baseline differences relative to experiment 1. I haven't talked about the reaction times, but if you're interested in the reaction times, we can talk about this in the question round. So our tentative conclusion based on these 2 studies is that the children first appear to settle for a weaker interpretation of the absolute adjectives. We find that when faced with imprecision, kids are overall more tolerant than adults, whereas when faced with precision, they perform at the same levels as adults. This suggests that there is no general semantic first to pragmatic second development trajectory, because if that was the case, we would have found the opposite development trajectory for imprecise items. We would have found that kids are less tolerant of it. And instead, it's more compatible with the weaker meaning first interpretation, in which kids accept a lot more pragmatic slack than adults. As they get older, they hone in on their interpretation of these adjectives, and they're able to kind of, they're more sensitive to the semantic interpretation. So that's it for me. Thanks a lot for having me here. These are some cute baby pictures of my collaborators. I'll let you figure out who is who. And yeah, looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. Time for questions. At the moment, it's like a 10 minutes.
I don't know how good you can hear me. It's like I think I need to take
Yes. I can
Okay,
hear you.
good. I don't. So I was wondering actually, because at some point when you talked about the older study, I think you said fuller instead of full, and then I was thinking, so which glass is fuller, not which glass is full, which is not what you should be asking, right? So the subjects were showing the full glass, not the fuller glass. Because otherwise,
oh yeah, sorry. Then I must have misspoken. Yeah. No, they're always using the positive form, not the comparative. So in the original study as well. So show me the full glass. Yeah. But I just wanted to say that there is one glass. Neither of the glasses was full, right? But there is one that is fuller than the other. But that's
exactly.
but that's not the what the experimenters were asking. Yeah.
This one's fuller than the other one. So there I was wondering, could it be that the smaller children haven't yet, like they kind of understand the concept of something being more of a thing than something else, but they don't yet have the comparative. So basically they're answering the question, which line is straighter, and are therefore more tolerant. Could that be a hypothesis, like possible explanation? Did you rule that out?
Okay, so let me rephrase your question to see if I understood it correctly. Okay, so are you asking whether it could be the case that they for the youngest kids, the semantics of relative adjectives is collapsed with that of absolute adjectives, basically, that kids understand full to mean fuller, and this is why they behave as if it was a relative adjective. Is that what you're
Exactly, so that they would overextend like full or fuller because they don't have the word fuller yet, so to speak, but the concept is there. Exactly.
Yes. So in the original, in this Reddit all paper, what they argue against that interpretation because they have data on they also had other absolute adjectives. So they had the adjective spotted, which is a minimal standard absolute adjective, and in there the kids behave appropriately. So they say like, okay, so they are able to understand the semantics of other absolute adjectives. And they have these reaction times. They rely on reaction time data to say that this is some sort of pragmatic enrichment. So basically, the youngest kids are super tolerant of imprecision, but they are slower. Let me see if I have those reaction times. So basically, this is the comparison between when the kids understand full in the context in which it is felicitously used. So one glass is objectively full. But there's this delay relative to when they're understanding it imprecisely. So they basically saying that this that there's some sort of that this kind of added processing effort is indexing the kind of pragmatic adjustment of the imprecise interpretation, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. So that means an additional load for a pragmatic. So even if it's not the onion hypothesis, that kind of still on top of the processing, you need semantic processing and then pragmatic processing. Would that be what that indicates?
Yeah, pretty much. So that basically will still be some sort of correlation between pragmatics and added effort that you're kind of manipulating on top of you're manipulating the semantic interpretation in some way, or adjusting how much pragmatic slack you're going to tolerate. And in our reaction times measure, do I have that here? We find also this difference. This is experiment 1, and this is across all age groups. We kind of replicate that finding as well, that there's this small kind of delay in the imprecise condition relative to the precise condition, which is also indicative that their kids are kind of doing some added pragmatic processing, even though they're very tolerant of it.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you.
People from groups have okay. Okay, we can you ask each question? There's a raising. So
You or the people in the chat, maybe. Chop those down.
There's a question. Chat. Would you?
このマックスちゃんがさっき言ってた。はいはい。
意味ない。
Oh, if you have a question, please, Janai, okay, there's no. Okay, please, did you, okay, please.
I have a question about the variation and the variability. So just, for example, say you had a 70% acceptance rate by participant. Does that, I mean, roughly, does that mean that people 70% of the time are accepting it and 30% of the time rejecting it? Or does it mean you have 70% of the kids or adults or whoever it is being categorical, more or less acceptors, and 30% being, or vice versa, 30% being rejectors? So I'm kind of curious where the variation lives. Is it per person? Is it variability of judgments within person, or is the variability across participants? And I think that's sort of an interesting, to me, it's interesting what that means. The fact that the 60% of the adults are accepting the imprecise condition, for example, does it mean that there's 40% of sticklers and 60% of, you know, or what? Yes, you don't have the data in the slides, but maybe you know.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think this relates somehow maybe to the in Ira's work. So in the Noveck papers where they talk about like people who are more pragmatic and people who are more semantic, there seems to be somewhat of a split. So in this data in particular, I think it's a little bit of both. So I mean, the way that we analyzed it was using linear mixed effects models. So we actually used age as a continuous variable, and we included random variation by participants and by items in the model. So even when you account for the fact that each participant could behave differently, there is still this overall developmental trajectory. So I think it lives both in the within subject variation, but also in the within item variation. That some items seem to be understood are more likely to be understood pragmatically than others. If that makes sense to you. So as far as I know, there's no clear split where like some people are super pragmatic are more willing to derive the utterance and some other not. It's kind of like kind of a general mix of both by participant and by item variation.
All right, thanks.
Question, can you your thoughts? Looking at the, okay, so in the chat there is a comment like looking at the group ages, how much the results depends on schooling and learning what the straight line is.
No, sorry, I don't think I quite understood the question. So looking at the, could you repeat that?
I mean, you can look at the chart. I mean, looking at the group ages.
Oh yeah.
Wait,
how do I look at that? All right. Oh yes, looking at the group ages. How much the results depend on schooling and learning what a straight line is. Let me think about that.
schooling. Teacher might.
Yes, so it's hard to tell. So the majority of our participants, even the youngest ones, were attending kindergarten, so they are already kind of being, I guess this is kind of already like, it's not really school, but it is some sort of organized kind of teaching environment. So I don't know how much Norwegians are taught about absolute adjectives when they're 3. It could be that it is some sort of that is related to schooling and learning what a straight line is. So this is definitely a phenomenon that would be interesting to test with other populations. But maybe the question asker Julie has something in mind in particular as to why this would be depend on schooling.
Hi, yeah, sorry. Thank you for the talk. Sorry, my camera is not working on this device. I didn't have anything in particular, but looking at the difference in your second experiment, and it struck me that those kids that have some exposure to, I don't know, geometry or something, that their straight line is has a more formal kind of definition. They start behaving like adults like. So I was
The older kids, yeah.
Maybe there is a difference between we are changing the context maybe even the definition of a straight is.
Yeah, so that's one possible interpretation, right? Like that kids basically just have a wider threshold of what counts as a precise interpretation, and then they just kind of through repeated exposure hone it in, and then this threshold gets narrower and narrower as they get older. Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. I guess I'm out of time. So thank you all for listening. I will share my slides on the chat.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, good.